Adolf Hitler was fully aware of the absolute necessity of success at the Battle of Kursk. He needed a success to re-establish the month lost in the disaster at Stalingrad. It was a gamble which was not destined to succeed. In the north, the effectiveness of a Russian defense limited the progress of von Klunger's 9th Army. In the south, von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army advanced 25 miles and threatened to penetrate the Voronezh front. Reserves from the Steppes front had to be pumped into the battle to bolster the salient's defenders and prevent the 4th Panzers from breaking through into open country. They succeeded, and the Germans had fallen into Zhukov's trap. From now on, the enemy was in undisputed possession of the initiative. Having enticed the Germans into total but disastrous commitment to their armored forces, the Red Army swiftly exploited their advantage. Even while the gargantuan tank struggle was still being bitterly contested, on the 12th of July, the Russians counterattacked towards Orel, which was itself a salient in German hands. The respectable Army Group Center, reinforced by units from the 4th Panzer Army, which had broken off its attack on Kursk, attempted to check the advance.
German Army Group Center was the implacable enemy of the Red Army. It had been its most implacable enemy since 1941, and it was still its most implacable enemy in 1944. Numerous attempts had been made by the Red Army and the High Command to destroy Army Group Center, and they couldn't. They tried and tried. Army Group Center held fast, absolutely and completely. Even at Stalingrad, by the way, very little is known about this. While Zhukov was actually organizing the counterattack at Stalingrad, he was also, by the way, on the 25th of November 1942, organizing an attack against Army Group Center. He was not distracted by Stalingrad, but he understood, as every Soviet commander did, that the enemy was Army Group Center, stationed right in the center of the Soviet-German front. Not only was it strategically important, it covered lines of communication, it covered important population centers, and above all, actually, it covered one thing the Russians desired above all, the shortest route to Germany and to Berlin. You couldn't go, well, you could go around, you could go down to, but really the only way was to blast their way through and get on to the highway to Berlin. So Army Group Center was an object of vital strategic importance for the Soviet High Command.
But by now, the Eastern Front was not the only theatre of disaster for the German armies. On the 10th of July, Allied forces had invaded Sicily. By the 25th, Mussolini had been arrested and a provisional government set up in Italy. Fearing the defection of his Mediterranean ally, Hitler desperately needed to make troops available for the defense of the peninsula. On August the 1st, he ordered an immediate withdrawal from the Oral salient. By the 5th of August, the provincial capitals of Orel and Belgorod had been liberated. Near Belgorod, the Germans attempted a counterattack with 60,000 troops and 18,000 Hitler Youth, who arrived at the front carrying flags with the ironic inscription, "The world belongs to us." The frenzied German counterstroke succeeded in pushing back the Red Army, but the Russian tide of resurgence was irresistible. After clawing their way forward for 10 days, the German advance was again flung backward towards the Dnieper. The Great Retreat was about to begin. The all-conquering German army which had disdainfully swept aside the Russian border defences only 2 years previously, was now struggling to maintain a presence in the field of battle. The panzer units, which had sliced the Red Army to pieces in a series of dazzling pincer movements, now flung themselves headlong at the Russians in the desperate hope of slowing their progress. For the ordinary German soldiers, the notion of victory ceased to have meaning. The survival of themselves and their immediate comrades became the central concern of their lives.
The situation in 1944 for the German army in the east looked catastrophic and was catastrophic. They had lost Army Group Center. Army Group North was breaking up very rapidly. Army Group South was desperately trying to hold onto the remnants of Soviet territory in Ukraine. So it appeared that the German army was on the run, and in some respects that was true. The losses were very considerable. They had lost many, many hundreds of thousands of men. Their losses in armor were considerable. And I suppose, speaking objectively, one should argue that, yes, this was the end of the line, but it wasn't. First of all, the German commanders, as opposed to Hitler, decided that one way in which they had a fighting chance, more than a fighting chance, would be to adopt an elastic mobile defense. In other words, not take all these Russian blows on the chin directly, but move back. Then there was a reasonable chance that the German army in the East would A, be able to survive, and even more important, what it would be able to do would in fact to be able to establish, if you like, some form of coherent defensive line, certainly further to the west, but against which very possibly the Red Army would throw itself and finally exhaust itself. The problem was that Hitler kept giving the opposite orders.
On the Russian side, the liberation of the cities and towns was proving a bittersweet experience. In Orel, the Soviet troops arrived to find half the town and all its bridges destroyed by the retreating Germans. Of the pre-war population of 114,000, only 30,000 haggard souls survived to greet their saviors. 25,000 had been sent as slaves to the labor camps of the Reich. 12,000 had been murdered by their German overlords, and thousands had died from disease and starvation. As the German forces began to move back, the partisan movement really exploded into life. Partisans taught demolition procedures, wireless operating, intelligence gathering, and how to forge and amend official German documentation.
Soviet partisans really consisted of three elements. One, there was a well-organized but very small-scale organized underground movement. Key members of the Communist Party were assigned to stay behind and build up resistance groups, but that was very specialized. The second group were civilians who were forced out by German terrorist action. Their homes were burned, blown up, relatives shot, people killed, slave labor was portending, who took to their heels and hid as best they could and would perhaps organize. The third part, of course, was, as I've said earlier, that the German army surrounded very large numbers of Red Army troops in 1941. You had encirclements of 300,000 men. Not all of these men were taken prisoner and gradually broke up, hid, were able to establish themselves as, if you like, small independent combat units, and would either get in touch with the local population to see what could be done, or in fact, a form of partisan organization was built up, very primitive, but nonetheless in existence. But gradually, by 1944, the Soviet partisan movement had become very substantially organized and then placed and was conducting its operations more or less in coordination with the Red Army. That was certainly the case as the Red Army crossed the Soviet frontiers and then had to make use of certainly of partisans, yes, for scouting, for intelligence, for support. So the partisan movement passed through those several stages, and by 1944 had become, I would say, it was an established, a very considerable feature of the Soviet war machine.
Besides the damage they inflicted on German troops and their morale, the partisans offered hope and example to those still in the midst of Nazi tyranny. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old member of the Moscow Komsomol, was caught setting fire to German stables in the village of Pestrievo. Although tortured, she revealed nothing about her comrades to the German interrogators. As she was led to the gallows with a placard around her neck describing her crime, she turned to her German captors and proclaimed defiantly, "You can't hang all 190 million of us." The story of Zoya was circulated widely, and she became a national heroine. Zoya grew to be a symbol not only of partisan resistance, but the defiance of Russian womanhood in the face of the most terrible adversity. The necessities of the war in the East smashed through most of the remaining barriers to women's contribution to the Soviet war effort. Despite the suffering which the German invasion had brought about, the people of the Soviet Union had taken everything that the Germans could throw at them, and the nation had held. By now, the majority of the population were willing cogs in a gigantic war machine. Civilians and soldiers alike seemed to grasp a new awareness of their role in the bitter conflict which raged all around them. The mood of the retreating Germans was one of intense frustration and manic desperation. Each man knowing he was staring death in the face. Their fury at certain death was unleashed towards civilians and soldiers alike. The Germans had been decisively defeated, but the war in the East was far from over. Even though a strategic withdrawal to the river Dnieper seemed the only possible option for the ragged German formations, Hitler initially stuck to his policy of holding territory to the last man. Von Tippelskirch, one of the German generals in the East, summed up the helpless rage of the field commanders forced to sacrifice men and material to a principle of no withdrawal, which had now been elevated to a moral necessity. A series of withdrawals by adequately large steps would have worn down the Russian strength, besides creating opportunities for counterstrokes when the German forces were numerous enough to make them effective. The root cause of the German defeat was the way her forces were wasted in fruitless efforts and, above all, fruitless resistance at the wrong time and place. By the 23rd of August, Kharkov was once again in Russian hands. By the 30th, Taganrog had fallen. The capture of Donbass was followed by Novorossiysk, and by the 25th of September, Smolensk had also been retaken. The waters of the Dnieper represented the only possibility of regrouping the decimated German divisions. For the pursuing Red Army, the liberation of the towns and villages east of the Dnieper continued to fill the hearts of its soldiers with a succession of contrasting emotions. The scenes of devastation and cruelty on a scale never even considered before. Pits full of dead children and the starved remains of whole families could only make their determination to totally crush their opposition complete. Even in retreat, the elite units of the German army, such as the Großdeutschland Division, managed to maintain something of their reputations by mounting a ferocious defense of the German rear. But the Dnieper was not to prove the refuge the battered German troops had been promised. Even as their defensive perimeter finally withdrew to the river's edge, they found the Russians already established there. Goaded onward by their commanders, by the atrocities they had witnessed, and the prospect of sweeping the enemy from the motherland, the Russians dispatched the German rear guard and immediately prepared to continue their pursuit. Between the 22nd and 30th of September, the Russians had forced numerous crossings of the 300-mile stretch of the river between the Pripyat marshes and Zaporozhye. Further south, by the 23rd of October, Zaporozhye and Melitop were taken by the Russians, and the 17th Army was isolated in the Crimea, reducing the dwindling strength of their eastern forces by a further 250,000. To the north, Kiev fell on the 6th of November, threatening the northern flank of Army Group South's defense of the Dnieper Bend. This Soviet pressure continued throughout November and December. Despite von Manstein's pleas to abandon what was now a vulnerable salient, Hitler remained adamant that the Dnieper Bend was to be held at all costs. By the new year of 1944, the line of German resistance from the Baltic to the Black Sea had either collapsed or was suffering such Russian pressure as to make it untenable. In Italy, the Allies had landed on September the 3rd and were battling their way up the peninsula. Back in Germany, the Reich was being subjected to destruction from the air on a scale never before experienced by any nation abroad. In the first major blow against Hamburg, 30,000 people perished in a series of raids which left many more scarred and burned. The noose around Germany was tightening rapidly, and the new year on the Eastern Front offered no relief from the process of strangulation. By January the 2nd, the Russians had advanced north of Kiev and were now just 18 miles from the Polish border. On the 14th of January, the offensive which came to be known as the Liberation of Leningrad was launched. Soviet forces smashed through the German defensive positions around the city, clearing the territory southwards as far as Novgorod. On the 17th of January, the besieged city was finally liberated. Leningrad had endured 900 days of isolation and unbelievable hardship. 1 million people had died.
From the point of view of the Leningraders, the lifting of the siege of Leningrad could not really accommodate too soon. Remember, it was 900 days of starvation, bombardment, hunger, death, privation, even now, as the Russians admit, days of cannibalism. So rations were down to very little. There was malnutrition, fortunately, there was very little disease. I think many people explain that thanks to the climate. It was very cold. But nonetheless, this was a city which had really suffered so dreadfully and appallingly. People were falling dead at their desks or at their workshops or at their places of work. There was a problem with children. Although many civilians had been evacuated, including civilians, there was still a large urban population. So the lifting of the siege of Leningrad was also very important militarily, because really what the Soviet command wanted to do, and it was crucial to the Soviet command, was to break the power of Army Group North, which in fact that was the German Army Group holding Leningrad, and indeed the western approaches of the Soviet Union and the Baltic states. So releasing Leningrad and then once again striking into the rear of Army Group North did two things. Yes, it liberated Leningrad. It gave the Russians an important psychological boost, but even more important, it pushed this army group away. And again, it gave the Soviet command access to the Baltic states, which was yet another route into the west, which was obviously the main direction of their strategic strike.
On the 4th of March, the northern flank of von Manstein's Army Group South was pierced by the 1st Ukrainian front under direct command of Marshal Zhukov. By the 7th, after advancing 100 miles, the Russians were astride the Warsaw-Odessa railway line, and by the 28th, Nikolaev on the Bug had been captured. Further south, the river Dniester was crossed, and Kherson, at the mouth of the Dnieper, overrun. By April, the Red Army's overstretched supply lines and the spring floods dictated an end to what was now being named the Mud Offensive. In the Crimea, however, The Russians continued to attack, and Sevastopol was taken on the 19th of May, bringing the northern shore of the Black Sea into Soviet hands once more. While the Russians were threatening the southern sector of the Eastern Front with collapse, events were unfolding off the south coast of England, which would completely alter the complexion of the war in the East. The long-awaited Second Front was about to be created. Until now, the Allied practical support had been limited to sending vehicles to support the Russians.
What happened was Great Britain and the United States sent the Soviet Union during the war about 22,000 aircraft and about 12,000 tanks. Well, when you consider the fact that the Russians produced 106,000 tanks during the war, then therefore our tank supplies were roughly somewhere about 10%. Though they were used actually, but I think the Russians found the tanks not very much use. I mean, they weren't like the T-34. They weren't fitted for operational conditions of the Eastern Front. But clearly the important thing from the Lend-Lease point of view was the 400,000 vehicles that we delivered to the Red Army. It made the Red Army mobile. Jeeps, Studebakers, the whole panoply of motor transport. That gave the Red Army a degree of mobility, which was extremely important. Certainly, once the Red Army started to move westwards, that is after, or slightly before, but certainly after the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army was not only an army of tank armies, it was also, from that point of view, a highly mobile army.
Now, in addition to supporting the Russians with supplies, the Allies were about to make a real contribution in the field. A fleet of over 5,000 vessels had been gathered together for the invasion of France. 1,200 naval vessels were on hand to sweep for mines, bombarded the German coastal defences, and protect the invaders from airborne and naval assault. 4,000 ships, barges, tugs, and amphibious craft were available for the transportation of the 2 million men and their weapons, which were to be landed on the northern coast of France over a 2-month period. 2 Mulberry harbours, as large as medium-sized ports, were to be towed across the channel in sections and constructed close to the French shore. In the air, 7,500 aircraft were mustered for the direct support of the invasion. In the early hours of the morning of the 6th of June, the first Allied paratroopers were dropped behind the targeted beaches. At dawn, 5 landing parties approached these beaches from the sea. By the first week in July, 1 million Allied soldiers had been landed. While the attention of the world focused on the D-Day landing and its aftermath, the Red Army launched a fresh offensive against Army Group Center in Belorussia.
Stalin actually opened that attack on June the 22nd, 1944, which was the anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, by the way. The point was not lost on lots of soldiers and many civilians. So Army Group Center, say, was a formidable mass of infantry and of armored concentrations. Its extent was also very considerable. It covered, both in the north and moving down to the south, as I say, it covered the key areas which the Russians wanted both for access and also for movement. And therefore it simply had to be destroyed. And this involved actually a Russian plan which was really quite complex. It meant, first of all, conducting what you might call a limited encirclement. First of all, to encircle the nearest German armies and then break them up. And the next stage was quite different, and that happened round about, well, it only took them about 10 days to do this, even less perhaps, and then to move out with mobile columns at high speed to conduct an even larger encirclement. And what the Russians did actually towards the end of June 1944 was to repeat, almost in the same place, the gigantic encirclement of German soldiers, which the German army had done to the Red Army in June and July of 1941.
The destruction of Army Group Center moved at lightning speed. Most of the 3rd Panzer Army was destroyed within a few days. At the beginning of July 1944, 100,000 German troops were encircled at Minsk. Within the week, Army Group Center had been effectively destroyed. An incision 250 miles wide had been sliced in the German front, and German casualties were estimated at 300,000. The Russian army now had a clear pathway to East Prussia and the Baltic. The failure of the Germans to deal with the summer offensive was emerging as a disaster on such a scale that even the debacle of Stalingrad paled in comparison. The war correspondent Alexander Werth reported from the Russian capital. In Moscow today, all hearts are filled with joy. The new places now being captured by the Russians are in distant Lithuania or in western Belarusia. Division after division has been encircled and wiped out, hundreds of thousands killed, and about 100,000 taken prisoner. The score of generals captured is about 25. Of these, 100,000 or so prisoners, 57,000 were paraded throughout the streets of Moscow with their generals at their head. The Germans had finally arrived in Moscow. When the parade was over, Russian sanitation trucks disinfected the streets. By the middle of July, the Germans had been swept from Belarusia and the Russians held much of northeast Poland. As they drove northwards into Lithuania, Army Group North was threatened with encirclement.
Army Group North was a very formidable force, contained veteran, battle-tested soldiers who were an extremely hard nut to crack. And the fighting in the north, even after the liberation of Leningrad, was very severe and very intensive. And the Red Army made relatively slow progress coming up against opposition like that. It did finally begin to break into the Baltic states, bit by bit. But that fighting went on largely until about March 1945, which shows you the nature of that resistance and the very considerable importance of that corridor which led westwards and northwestwards.
South of the Pripyat Marsh, the Russians were making faster progress. Army Group North Ukraine were flung back beyond Lvov and Lublin. By the end of the month, units of the Red Army had reached the Vistula and were attacking the Warsaw suburbs. On the 1st of August, the Polish Home Army Command in London, anxious that the Polish capital should not fall into the hands of the advancing Soviets, ordered the Warsaw partisans to rise against their Nazi oppressors. It was to prove a tragic mistake. The 20,000 insurgents held only enough ammunition for 7 days fighting. By the end of the battle, after 2 months of bitter struggle, 9/10 of the city had been destroyed, 200,000 people had been massacred, and the rest deported to extermination camps. The SS had organized an orgy of savagery, sousing people with petrol and setting them alight, gassing them in the sewers, and subjecting them to a nightmare regime of torture and out-of-hand execution. During this period, the Red Army remained on the outskirts of the city. Stalin was accused of standing by while this barbarous campaign of reprisal wiped out any opposition to Russian domination of Poland. On the 20th of August, the Soviet army unexpectedly launched a huge offensive against Romania, which was a major issue for Hitler.
Hitler was obsessed with the southern flank. He maintained that if it was at all possible to destroy Soviet access to the oil fields, if it was possible, if you like, to cut the lifeline of the Soviet Republic, then in fact the war would come quickly to an end. He was intent, he said actually, that one of his main objectives was to seize the oil of the Caucasus. And even in 1940, that is long before the German invasion of Russia, Hitler had taken great care to send a very powerful German military mission to Romania and to make absolutely sure that the Romanian oil fields were heavily protected. So his concern, if you like, for the economic potential of southeastern Europe, which obviously involved Romania, was very important. And it had a political importance as well. This was to show, for example, that this wasn't just a German invasion of the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, the Axis in action. And if you look at the composition of the forces which invaded the Soviet Union, they included Italians, they included Slovaks, they included, there was a Spanish element as well later on. There were Romanians, there were Hungarians. So from that point of view, it was, I think, if you like, in Hitler's terms, a kind of multinational political and military crusade which he was both organizing and which he was intending to commit in what was his own crusade for the elimination of what he called Jewish Bolshevism.
By the 23rd, 20 divisions of the German 6th Army had been encircled in a giant pocket between the rivers Dniester and Prut, an action which was admired by the eminent military historian Ziemke, who noted, "In executing their breakthroughs, the Russians showed an elegance in their tactical conceptions, economy of force and control that did not fall short of the Germans' own performance in the early war years." The effect of these reverses on Hitler was catastrophic. Increasingly, he retreated into a semi-fantasy world, which did not correspond to the realities of the battlefield. It seemed that he hoped to hide from the public eye until he could once again force events to conform to the pattern he had enjoyed until 1942. So he continued to hide himself away in his headquarters, embarrassed to face up to the hollowness of his boasts. Hitler's ostensible reason for shutting himself away was the demands made on him by the war. In reality, he was hiding from the humiliating pattern of failure. The commanders in the East, nevertheless, had to deal with the orders of this shambling reclusive, who was now a pathetic shadow of the decisive, intuitive and supremely arrogant leader who had launched Operation Barbarossa. Stalin sent the Red Army of Liberation northwards. And by the 31st of August, Bucharest had been entered. An essentially communist government was formed, and Romania was compelled to ratify its 1940 loss of territory to Russia. It was also forced to pay the Soviet Union a financial indemnity and use its army to fight against its erstwhile allies. The Red Army had advanced 250 miles in 12 days. In the next 6 days, it dashed a further 200 miles to the Yugoslav border at Turnu Severin. From here, the Soviets launched a giant flanking maneuver against the Axis defenders of Hungary. By the 24th of September, the southeast salient of Hungary had been removed, and the Russians had advanced to within 100 miles of Budapest.
From a strategic point of view, the whole of that southeastern area was of great importance. And its importance was no more dramatically demonstrated than in the summer of 1944, when Romania defected from the Axis alliance, from the German alliance. And what happened then was the whole of not the southern wing, but the southern front began to cave in. In other words, Hungary and Romania were, in many respects, a strategic buttress, if you like, or a strategic glacis, which were very important to Hitler. And signs of disaffection after the defeat of and destruction of the Romanian armies at Stalingrad, or the Hungarian armies, signs of disaffection in southeastern Europe, I think were more than slightly alarming to Hitler. I mean, the realization that, if you like, the structure of his alliance and the nature of his military organization, that is in strategic terms, was beginning to crumble.
Further south, the Yugoslav capital, Belgrade, was liberated with the aid of the Yugoslavian resistance under Tito. Bulgaria, until now at war only with Britain and the United States, was pressurized by Germany into declaring war on the USSR as well. 4 days after this declaration of the 5th of September, the Bulgarians surrendered. Further west, Slovakia, formerly a co-belligerent of Germany, had been in a state of upheaval since the previous year. A general uprising began in the second half of 1944, but a Russian advance, which began in September, was held up in the Carpathians by stiff German resistance and failed to reach Slovakia before the middle of October. By then, the 65,000-strong uprising had been quelled. The, by now, sickeningly familiar results of Nazi barbarity greeted Russian liberators, and more than 200 mass graves had been filled with slaughtered Slovaks. In the north, an armistice was concluded with Finland, and the Germans driven back into Norway before climatic conditions put an end to the fighting there. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were overrun, and the German Army Group North isolated in the Courland Peninsula. By January 1945, with all German troops finally driven from the holy soil of Mother Russia, and Stalin in control of the Balkans and the Baltic states, the Red Army prepared for its final drive towards the Reich. Between June and November, the German army in the east had suffered over 1 million casualties, 214,000 killed, and 629,000 missing in action. Another approximately 600,000 men had been seriously wounded. 1944 had proved Germany's most disastrous year of the war in the east. 106 divisions had been destroyed, 3 more than the total number mobilized in September 1939. German intelligence estimated that in the assault on the Reich, the Red Army would possess a superiority of 11 to 1 in infantry, 7 to 1 in tanks, and 20 to 1 in guns. Hitler dismissed such estimates as bluff. On the 12th of January, the Soviets launched their expected offensive from the Vistula against the German Central Front. The 70 divisions of Army Group Center and Army Group A were pierced over an area of 200 miles, and almost 200 divisions of the Red Army poured through the breach. By the end of the month, Soviet forces reached the lower reaches of the River Oder and were now only 40 miles from Berlin. The remnants of Army Group Center had been encircled in East Prussia. Falling back on the ancient city of Königsburg, they pathetically attempted to carry out Hitler's order to defend the region to a man. The Soviet tide was finally halted on the line of the River Oder and Neisse in February. But the limited German counterstroke was merely postponing the inevitable. A fresh Russian offensive in Hungary progressed to the borders of Austria by April the 1st, and 6 days later, the outskirts of Vienna were coming under Soviet fire.
Hitler was not a German, he was an Austrian. And this, if one looks at his attitudes and his predilections, his commitments, and, if you like, his emotional drive, it is towards, all right, southeastern Europe, to Hungary, Romania, and other areas. If you like, it's some kind of reflection, it's almost the shadow of the Habsburg Empire, which was, of course, crucially strategically important. It was politically important, it was economically important, but also I think it had for Hitler this emotional attraction, this sense that if this entity or these entities broke up, if the Bolshevik hordes broke into this area, then indeed this was the final cataclysm and this spelled actual doom.
To the north, on April the 16th, the final thrust towards Berlin began. On the first day of the assault alone, 42,000 artillery pieces and mortars fired 2,450 freight car loads of shells towards the German lines. Zhukov, excited at the prospect of being the first Soviet commander to reach Berlin, opened the attack, lighting the battlefield with searchlights to blind the enemy. Having retreated to the capital, Hitler alternated between vitriolic outbursts about betrayal and demonic delight in the Holocaust which was descending on Germany. In the words of Albert Speer, he deliberately attempted to make everything perish with him. Army, state and economic leaders tried to mediate Hitler's destructiveness with varying degrees of success. By the 22nd of April, with Russian troops now fighting on the streets of the German capital, the insanity was about to end. But the street warfare in Berlin was bitter. The threat of a Bolshevik invasion had been hyped by the Nazi propaganda machine as the end of Germany and the German people. Even in the last chaotic days of the Reich, there was a common joke. Enjoy the war while you can. The peace will be terrible. On the night of the 28th of April, with the Russian forces grinding ever closer to his headquarters, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun. After the wedding meal, he retired to write his last will and testament. He defiantly reaffirmed his belief in Lebensraum and indulged in one vitriolic attack on the Jewish race. On the afternoon of the 30th of April, having made his farewells, he poisoned his wife and his dog and shot himself. The Hitler's bodies were burned on a petrol-soaked pyre, to be joined the following night by Dr. and Frau Goebbels and their 6 children, which they had poisoned. On the same evening that Hitler, Sergeants Yagorov and Kantaria planted the victory banner of the Soviet flag on the Reichstag at 22:50 hours. It symbolized the triumph of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany. But the cost had been horrendous. By the 8th of May, when the German Act of Surrender was ratified at Russian headquarters in Berlin, 28 million Russians, 1 in 7 of the population, had died as a direct result of the war. They had died as soldiers, partisans, prisoners of war, slaves, or innocent civilians. They had met their end through bombs, bullets, hunger, torture, burning, and exposure. Less than 5% of the young people aged between 17 and 21 had survived. For each of the 1,418 days of the war, almost 19,000 Russian people had perished. The German invaders destroyed or burnt 1,700 towns and more than 70,000 villages and hamlets, decommissioned 60% of the steelworks and 60% of the coal mines, destroyed 65,000 kilometers of railway lines and 4,100 stations, 36,000 communication centers, and tens of thousands of state farms. They looted and demolished 40,000 medical establishments, 84,000 schools, and 43,000 public libraries. 25 million people had been left homeless. But in the end, the Germans had been defeated. Throughout Western Europe, Germans from the SS, the army, and the civilian administration were put on trial for offences committed during the Nazi occupation. However, the number punished and the severity of their sentences was astonishingly limited given the massive scale of the crimes against humanity which had occurred. Even though the Russian government had the right to hold its own trials under Article 10 of the Four-Power Ordinance, none took place. Stalin was far more concerned about taking vengeance on traitors to the Soviet Union. Some 250,000 prisoners of war, now in Allied hands, were Soviet citizens who had been captured in German uniform. Under agreements affirmed at the Yalta Conference in 1945, those accused of treason or desertion were to be returned to their native countries for judgment. Those who had fought for the Germans were now forcibly repatriated. Some took the only escape route open to them and committed suicide. The Soviet authorities regarded these traitors as human scum and treated them with a barbarity which reflected their hatred. Another 2.25 million Russian prisoners of war had been captured during the occupation or had surrendered on the fields of battle. Tragically, Russian administrators seemed to view their very survival as an act of treachery. Many who had lived through years of gruesome warfare and the savage, inhuman degradation of the German work camps were now to spend the remainder of their time in the penal colonies of their own motherland. Inside Russia, the pre-war status quo was rapidly re-established and strengthened. The cult of Stalin as a personalization of victory ensured that his position as dictator of an authoritarian, centralized society was unassailable. The reforms and liberalizations which had occurred during the organized chaos of the war years were gradually retracted. Religious toleration, a greater modicum of democratic involvement in civilian administration, and the virtues of individual and collective initiative became incompatible with the need for the entrenched elite to control all aspects of social development. But none of this should detract from the awesome achievement of the Soviet people. Through their bravery, their labor, and their sacrifice, they managed to halt and eventually crush a seemingly invincible war machine which, with chilling efficiency, had conquered almost the entire Western European continent in a matter of months. They annihilated a German army which had unleashed in its wake a regime of apocalyptic terror. A tyranny which had turned vast tracts of Europe into a surreal playground of sadists and perverts. The victory of the Soviet people may not have ensured an era of justice and democratic ideals, but rid the world of the cancerous malignancy of National Socialism, which had for long periods threatened to engulf it.